Good evening. This is Bill. I'm going to give you an update on the excess deaths for 2023. And long story short, there weren't very many. So, anyway, one thing I've noticed that the CDC used to report this data in a nice format where you had the deaths by different categories, and they have that format up to about 8 months for last year, but unfortunately they said they're not going to keep that table up to date. They're putting it onto the Wonder website where it seems to be in a different format, so I don't know if it's going to be as easy to keep this up to date in the future. So, but anyway, I do the same thing as I reported last year, where you go ahead and you basically load all the data into a computer program that tracks it by time, and then you go ahead and fit a line to the data prior to 2020 to try to extract forward what you think the deaths would have been in the future years had COVID not come about. So, here's a graph of U.S. deaths versus year. And the black line here is the actual number of deaths. And one of the reasons why it's steadily going up, say even prior to 2020, is because the population is growing and aging. So that would be expected. The dashed line is an attempt to fit the pre-2020 data to a linear line so that we can get an estimate of what you think deaths would have been in 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, so that we can get a more accurate estimate of what excess deaths would be, as opposed to just saying using 2019 as a baseline year. Okay, here's a graph of deaths broken down by different categories. You see you got heart and cancer and unintended injuries and so on. We do the same thing here. We take the actual deaths and we fit a line to the data prior to 2020 so that we can get an estimate of what we think deaths would have been in 2020, 2021, and 2022 had COVID not been a thing. So how good that line fits gives you some idea how confident you can be in the estimate of excess deaths. So the number on the right here is what we call a correlation coefficient. If it's 1, it means you're very confident in the prediction. And if it's 0, it's very not good at making a prediction. So you can see that like for heart disease and stroke and diabetes, the correlation is pretty good. So we can be pretty confident that as you see these spikes up here and here and here, that this was probably a result of lockdown policies. And then of course the number on the left here is the actual number of excess or deficit deaths. You can notice that COVID spiked up as high, and of course it has a perfect correlation because we could confidently predict that if COVID not come around, there would have been 0 deaths in 2020 and onward. Now the thing that's interesting is in 2023, you can see that COVID is coming back down to close to 0. And as you can see for the heart disease, cancer, the stroke, and the Alzheimer, these are all in 2023 starting to trend back down close to 0. Suicides is interesting because it kind of steadily goes up fairly linearly with a good correlation until 2020. It actually took a drop. And then it suddenly goes back up, starting to head back up towards trend line. 2022 apparently was a record year for suicides, but it's actually less than what the trend line would have predicted. So I guess we're actually not doing as badly with that as people are saying. This next graph here is basically the previous one, except what we've done is we've taken the trend line off the data so that way a normal year would be 0, and so anything positive would be excess deaths, anything negative would be deficit deaths. And the dashed lines here and here gives you some estimate of the uncertainty in the forward moving prediction. So anything above those lines would be excess deaths. Would be deaths probably due to the COVID policies of lockdown. And it's probably no coincidence that you see heart, especially stroke and diabetes. Things that are generally associated with fitness and lack of physical activity really spiked up as a result of these lockdown policies and keeping people at home. And of course, cancer went up quite a bit too. And that probably could be a combination of physical activity, but also probably a combination of people not getting screens and necessary treatment for that, because hospitals were limited in what they could do, especially in 2020. And yeah, and so anyway, this is what it is. Yeah, I've always been a critic of these lockdown policies, and because I think it really affected people's fitness quite a bit, and I think it's just reflected in the fact that a lot of these fitness-oriented type illnesses, heart, stroke, and diabetes spiked up. Cancer may be more controversial, but it also went up too. Fortunately, it seems like those categories are going back down to what we expect now. But one of the things that's interesting is that people have also implicated the vaccine for these additional deaths. And I think I could show that vaccine probably is not playing a big role, at least in the big picture here, because if you take two aspects as, I think accepted. One of them is 2020, basically the vaccine wasn't around. It only came in very late in 2020, so it really couldn't have contributed to the excess deaths in that year. And the other thing I think is accepted that heart disease, or I should say the vaccine, while it can certainly affect in the heart, I have not heard anyone say that it can give you diabetes or metabolic problems. So in the next plot I'm going to show you the ratio of heart to diabetes, and see if there's any evidence of the vaccine influencing the number of deaths here. Okay, so here's what we have. This plot here shows the ratio of diabetes to heart disease. This is total deaths. So in the previous years, you can see it steadily going up, which what that says is that we're probably doing a little better job of managing heart disease than we are metabolic problems associated with diabetes, just over time. But then in 2020, it took a big jump up. And this is probably because of unequal effect of the lockdowns and lack of physical activity causing people to be more susceptible to metabolic problems than maybe even heart disease. People probably just gain weight from just staying at home too much. Now, in 2021, you'll notice this ratio actually even gets a little bit worse, but if the vaccine was creating a big increase in heart disease, and assuming it didn't have any impact on diabetes and metabolic disorders, this should have taken a big drop down. And it doesn't do that, so it doesn't seem like the vaccine really played a big role here, because a lot of people got vaccinated in 2021, and of course even 2022 we're over here. We're still showing a pretty strong enhanced ratio. Now, stroke and heart tends to be pretty steady, and maybe that's to be expected, because I think the vaccine impact on both of these might be fairly similar. Stroke in the case of blood clotting, which vaccine can do, and heart with myocarditis and its other issues. Over here, you notice that cancer actually took a drop in the ratio, which probably shows that the lockdown certainly increased the cancer deaths, but not as dramatically as it did for the heart disease. And this curve's interesting too. This is COVID. During the worst of it, which is 2021. You had 10 COVID deaths for every one flu death. This is COVID to flu here. But you can see that in 2023, we're almost back to 1. In other words, we're getting 1 COVID death for every 1 flu death. So basically, it's no worse than the flu. So the take-home message here is that these lockdowns were pretty deadly. I mean, you had about 1 million excess deaths due to COVID, and then on top of that, we had 250,000 excess deaths due to, mostly dominated by heart disease, cancer, stroke, and diabetes. And most of these were mainly due to just people getting lack of physical exercise because they were locked up in their homes. And so, yeah, I mean, it's kind of scary when you think about how fragile and unhealthy the American population should be to think that lockdowns would have done this. But this data says that it is what it is. And the terrible part about all this is that, while I'm no fan of this vaccine, I don't see any evidence that the vaccine really contributed significantly to these excess deaths. But one thing the vaccine definitely did was, I think, drive these lockdown policies further than they needed to go, because, what would start out as 2 weeks to slow the spread, which, actually, I think that probably was a reasonable policy just to make sure hospitals didn't get overwhelmed. But what ended up happening, it became a permanent lockdown until everyone's vaccinated. And, of course, this was the agenda being pushed by all the health people in the government, and all these people were big pharma bros. So, of course they're going to do that because it just made their industry so much more money. I mean, the government paid for the development costs and all the vaccines that they could make. I mean, it really was total socialism. And I guess this is all I have to say about this. I hope we learn from this. Well, we should learn from it. Next time we got to stand up and resist this. I mean, this is just should be a wake-up call for what our government did to us and Big Pharma. So, yeah, thank you for listening.